Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep you think you've laid it to rest. Martha Brennan wiped the sweat from her forehead as she and Harold stood before Storage Unit 247 in the suffocating Louisiana heat. The auctioneer's gavel had just fallen. $20 for whatever secrets lay behind that rusted metal door. At 73, Martha had learned to spot treasure where others saw trash, a skill honed from decades of teaching children to see potential in the broken and discarded. But when Harold lifted that door, the stale air that rushed out carried something more than dust and neglect. It carried the scent of river water and old wood, impossible in a concrete box that had been sealed for years. And there, gleaming as if it had just rolled off the shipyard, sat the bow of a riverboat that couldn't possibly fit in the space before them. Martha reached for the brass nameplate, the Evangeline, and the moment her fingers made contact, the world tilted. Suddenly, she was 23 again, but not herself. She was someone else, someone desperate, someone running with a secret that men had died to protect. What happens when the past reaches through time to reclaim what was stolen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left Martha gasping as if she'd been pulled from deep water. Harold's weathered hand gripped her elbow, steadying her against the doorframe of the storage unit. "Martha, you've gone pale as a sheet." She blinked hard, trying to shake off the lingering sensation of someone else's memories clinging to her mind like cobwebs. The taste of fear still coated her tongue, not her own fear, but that of a young woman whose heart had hammered as she'd guided a boat through midnight waters. "I'm fine," Martha managed, though her voice came out thinner than intended. "Just the heat." Harold's concerned expression suggested he wasn't buying it, but after 48 years of marriage, he knew when to press and when to let her gather herself. He turned his attention back to the impossible sight before them. The riverboat, or at least the front portion of it, occupied the 12 by 12 storage space as if reality had folded itself to accommodate the vessel. The white hull gleamed despite the unit's perpetual darkness, and brass fixtures caught what little light filtered in from the parking lot. The deck rose at least 8 feet, yet somehow fit beneath the unit's concrete ceiling. "This don't make a lick of sense," Harold muttered, running his fingers through what remained of his silver hair. His postal worker's mind, trained by decades of organizing and cataloging, rebelled against the spatial impossibility. "How'd they get this thing in here? Hell, how'd they build it in here?" Martha stepped closer, drawn by a pull she couldn't name. The scent of river water grew stronger, mixed with something else, jasmine and old perfume, as if a woman had passed by moments before. Her practical mind, shaped by 30 years of managing unruly middle schoolers, told her to be cautious, but curiosity had always been her weakness, the trait that had led her to garage sales and estate auctions, searching for forgotten treasures to stretch their meager pension. The boat's details were exquisite. Hand-carved railings ran along the deck, and small portholes lined the cabin walls. Everything appeared freshly maintained, from the polished brass nameplate to the spotless white paint. It was as if the Evangeline had been waiting in pristine condition for someone to find her. "Martha, don't touch anything else," Harold warned, recognizing the look in her eyes. "Not until we figure out what we're dealing with." Too late. Her fingers had already found the ship's wheel, an ornate piece of carved wood and brass that seemed to call to her. The moment her palm made contact, the world shifted again. This time, the vision was stronger. She was no longer Martha Brennan, retired teacher from Magnolia Bend. She was Celeste, her hands steady on this very wheel as she navigated by moonlight. Behind her, in the boat's cabin, lay wooden crates heavy with gold coins, payment for sins that had stained Louisiana soil for generations. The Arsenault family thought their wealth made them untouchable, but they were wrong, dead wrong. Men shouted from the shore. Gunshots cracked across the water. Celeste pushed the throttle forward, her heart pounding as she guided the Evangeline toward a destiny that— "Martha!" Harold's sharp voice yanked her back to the present. His hands covered hers, pulling them away from the wheel. "You were talking, saying things about gold and someone named Celeste." She stared at him, disoriented. The storage unit's concrete walls felt alien after the open expanse of the Mississippi River at midnight. "I saw her, Harold. I saw what happened." "Saw who? What are you talking about?" Before Martha could answer, a shadow fell across the storage unit's entrance. They turned to find a man silhouetted against the afternoon sun, his expensive suit out of place in the run-down facility. He was younger than them, maybe 50, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the cultured drawl of old Louisiana money. "I couldn't help but notice you folks seemed to have found something interesting." Harold stepped protectively in front of Martha, though at 75, his protecting days were mostly behind him. "It's our unit, bought and paid for." The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. I'm sure everything is perfectly legal. I'm Antoine Arsenault." He paused, as if the name should mean something to them. "My family has been looking for this particular boat for quite some time. I'd be willing to offer you a substantial sum for it." Martha felt ice form in her stomach, despite the Louisiana heat. Arsenault, the name from Celeste's memories, wrapped in terror and desperate flight. She grabbed Harold's arm, suddenly understanding that their $20 bargain had purchased more than they'd imagined, much more than they could possibly afford. "We just found it," Harold said carefully. "Haven't even figured out what it is yet." Antoine's smile widened, revealing teeth too white and too sharp. "Oh, I can tell you exactly what it is, Mr. Brennan, Harold Brennan. Mr. Brennan, that's the Evangeline, and she's been missing from my family's collection for 79 years. Harold felt the familiar ache in his lower back as he straightened, a reminder of 43 years carrying mail bags through Magnolia Bend's unforgiving humidity. The confrontation with Antoine Arsenault had left him rattled in a way that decades of dealing with angry customers over delayed packages never had. This man's presence felt different, predatory, like the water moccasins that lurked in the bayou behind their house. "Well," Harold said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "I reckon we'll need to do some research before we make any decisions about selling." He reached for the storage unit's rolling door, but Antoine stepped forward, close enough that Harold could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, the metallic scent of old money and older secrets. "Research might not be necessary, Mr. Brennan. I can tell you everything you need to know about the Evangeline's history, her specifications, her previous owners, her unfortunate disappearance during the war years." Antoine's gaze shifted to Martha, who had remained unusually quiet. "Has she spoken to you yet? Sometimes these old vessels hold on to memories." Martha's grip on Harold's arm tightened. The man's casual reference to the boat speaking made her stomach turn. How could he possibly know about the visions, about Celeste? "Boats don't talk, son," Harold replied, though his confidence wavered. After what he'd witnessed in the past hour, he wasn't sure what was possible anymore. Antoine chuckled, a sound like autumn leaves rustling. "Of course not. Just an old family saying. But if you change your mind about selling day or night, you can reach me at this number." He produced a cream-colored business card from his jacket pocket, pressing it into Harold's reluctant hand. "The Arsenault family has always been generous with fair compensation for returned property." The emphasis on returned wasn't lost on either of them. Antoine tipped an imaginary hat, his smile never faltering as he walked away. Only when his black sedan disappeared beyond the facility's chain-link fence did Harold dare to breathe normally again. "We need to go home," Martha whispered. "We need to think." Harold nodded, pulling the storage unit door down with more force than necessary. The metal clanged shut, sealing the Evangeline back into darkness, but not before Martha caught one last glimpse of the boat's pristine bow. Even through the concrete barrier, she could swear she heard the gentle lapping of water against a hull. The drive home to their small house on Magnolia Street took 15 minutes, but felt longer with Martha staring silently out the passenger window. Harold's mind raced through practical considerations, the same methodical thinking that had served him well sorting mail for 4 decades. Storage fees, insurance implications, the logistics of moving a boat that shouldn't fit where they'd found it. But underneath the practical thoughts lurked something he didn't want to acknowledge: the fear that their quiet retirement was about to be shattered. Their house sat on a quarter-acre lot Harold's father had helped him buy in 1978, back when a postal worker's salary meant something. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen where Martha had cooked thousands of meals on a stove that predated their marriage. The azaleas she'd planted 20 years ago bloomed pink and white along the front porch, and Harold's tomato garden sprawled across the backyard in neat rows that would make any former postal employee proud. This was their world, modest, predictable, safe. Harold's pension combined with Martha's teacher's retirement gave them just enough to cover the mortgage, utilities, and Martha's medications for the arthritis that had ended her classroom career 2 years early. They ate dinner at 5:30, watched the evening news, and went to bed by 10. Saturday mornings meant garage sales and estate auctions. Sunday mornings meant church at First Baptist, where they'd worshipped since Carter was president. It wasn't exciting, but it was theirs. They'd worked for it, saved for it, planned for it through all those years when Harold walked his routes in Louisiana heat and Martha graded papers at their kitchen table. Their greatest adventure had been a cruise to the Caribbean for their 40th anniversary, and their biggest worry had been whether Harold's Social Security would be enough when he turned 78 next year. Now, sitting in their familiar living room surrounded by 48 years of shared memories, Martha's collection of ceramic angels on the mantelpiece, Harold's military service medals in their frame, photographs of nieces and nephews they'd helped raise after Harold's sister died, Martha felt the weight of how much they had to lose. "Harold," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that man knew things. About the boat, about what I saw when I touched it." Harold settled beside her on the couch they'd bought during the Clinton administration, his joints protesting the day's exertions. "What exactly did you see, honey? And don't tell me it was just the heat." Martha closed her eyes, and for a moment she was Celeste again, young, desperate, fighting for something larger than herself. When she opened them, Harold was waiting with the same patient expression he'd worn through thousands of small domestic crises. "I saw justice, Harold, and I saw why someone might kill for it." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Harold studied his wife's face, noting the way her fingers trembled against her coffee mug, the same blue ceramic cup she'd used every morning for the past decade. In 48 years of marriage, he'd seen Martha handle angry parents, defiant teenagers, and the death of both her parents with steady resolve. Whatever she'd experienced in that storage unit had shaken something fundamental in her. "Tell me," he said simply. Martha set down her mug with careful precision. "When I touched that wheel, I wasn't me anymore. I was a young woman named Celeste, and I was stealing a boat full of Confederate gold from the Arsenault family. It was 1943, Harold, the middle of World War II, and this woman, she was risking everything because the Arsenaults had done something terrible, something that couldn't be forgiven." Harold leaned back, his postal worker's skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "You're talking about seeing the past, like some kind of crazy old woman?" Martha's voice carried an edge he rarely heard. "I know how it sounds, but that man today, Antoine, he knew. When he asked if the boat had spoken to me, he wasn't being poetic. This has happened before." Before Harold could respond, the phone rang. The old rotary model on the kitchen counter, they'd never seen the need to upgrade, jangled with mechanical insistence. Harold started to rise, but Martha caught his arm. "Don't answer it, Martha. It's probably just—" The ringing stopped. In the sudden quiet, they could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking towards 6 o'clock. Then the phone started again. This time Harold stood despite Martha's grip. "Honey, you're letting this get to you. It's probably Helen calling about Sunday dinner, or maybe Bill from down the street. He lifted the heavy receiver on the fourth ring. Brennan residence. Good evening, Mr. Brennan. Antoine Arsenault's cultured voice filled the kitchen through the old phone's tinny speaker. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. Harold's mouth went dry. They'd never given the man their phone number, and it wasn't listed. Hadn't been since Martha started receiving strange calls after a parent-teacher conference had gone badly 5 years ago. How did you get this number? Information has a way of finding the right hands, Mr. Brennan. I'm calling because I wanted to make my offer more specific. $50,000 cash for the Evangeline and anything found with her. No questions asked, no paperwork required. Just a simple transaction between neighbors. $50,000. Harold's mind reeled. That was more than his annual pension, enough to fix the roof, replace Martha's aging Honda. Maybe even take that trip to Ireland she'd always talked about. All for a boat that shouldn't exist in a space where it couldn't fit. That's a generous offer, Mr. Arsenault. But like I said, we need time to think. Of course. But Harold, may I call you Harold? Time has a way of complicating simple situations. Other parties might become interested. Local authorities might ask difficult questions about how such a vessel came to be stored in such an unusual manner. The media loves stories about mysterious discoveries, don't they? The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Harold felt Martha's eyes on him from the living room, her face pale in the lamplight. I appreciate the offer, Harold said carefully. We'll be in touch. I certainly hope so. Oh, and Harold, Martha shouldn't touch the boat again. Some memories are better left undisturbed. The line went dead. Harold hung up the receiver with shaking hands. $50,000. More money than they'd ever had at one time in their lives. All they had to do was walk away from a discovery that defied explanation and pretend they'd never found justice calling from across 7 decades. He returned to the living room to find Martha standing by the window, peering through the curtains at the street outside. "Grey sedan," she said without turning around, parked under the oak tree across from the Hendersons' house. Same car that was at the storage facility, just different parking spot. Harold joined her at the window. Sure enough, a luxury sedan sat in the shadows where no car had been when they'd arrived home. Could be coincidence. Could be. Martha let the curtain fall. He offered $50,000, didn't he? I could hear it in your voice when you hung up. Harold nodded, sinking into his recliner. More money than we've ever seen. Money to keep quiet about what we found. Money to forget about Celeste and whatever justice she was trying to serve. Martha turned from the window, and Harold saw something in her expression he hadn't witnessed since her teaching days. The look she'd worn when facing down the school board over funding cuts or standing up to parents who thought their children were above consequences. Harold, we have a choice to make. We can take the money and pretend this never happened, go back to our quiet life and let whatever happened in 1943 stay buried. Or, Martha's chin lifted with the stubborn determination that had first attracted him to her in 1975. Or we find out why a woman named Celeste thought stealing from the Arsenaults was worth risking her life, and why they're so desperate to get her boat back that they're watching our house. Harold stared at his wife, seeing the fire in her eyes that had drawn him to her all those years ago, and feeling his stomach clench with dread. In the lamplight, Martha looked younger somehow, as if Celeste's memories had awakened something that retirement had put to sleep. But Harold felt every one of his 75 years, along with the weight of everything they could lose. Martha, honey, listen to yourself. You're talking about taking on a family that's been powerful in Louisiana since before we were born. A family with enough money to find our unlisted phone number in one afternoon, and enough reach to have us watched. He gestured toward the window where the sedan waited like a patient predator. We're not private investigators. We're not young. We're just 2 old people who bought a storage unit and found more than we bargained for. Martha's jaw tightened. So we should just hand over whatever Celeste died trying to protect. We don't know that she died, Harold said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. And we don't know what she was protecting, or if she was even right to take it. For all we know, this Celeste was the criminal, not the arsonose. You saw that boat, Harold. You felt what I felt in there. That wasn't the memory of a thief. That was someone fighting for justice. Harold rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. The practical part of his mind, the part that had sorted mail for 4 decades without losing a single package, catalogued the risks with ruthless efficiency. They had no legal claim to whatever was on that boat, no evidence of wrongdoing beyond Martha's visions, which no police officer or lawyer would take seriously. No allies, no resources, no plan. What they did have was a house with a 30-year mortgage that still had 12 years left on it, prescription medications that cost more each month than they'd ever imagined, a 20-year-old Honda that wouldn't survive another Louisiana winter without major repairs, and each other, 2 people in their 70s whose biggest adventure in recent years had been trying a new restaurant in Baton Rouge. Martha, be realistic. What exactly are we going to do? Walk into the police station and tell them we found a boat that's too big for its storage unit, and when you touched it, you had visions of a woman who may or may not have stolen Confederate gold 79 years ago? Harold's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. They'll think we've lost our minds. Maybe we have, Martha said quietly. Maybe I have. But Harold, I can't shake the feeling that we found that boat for a reason. That Celeste has been waiting all these years for someone to finish what she started. Harold stood abruptly, pacing to the mantelpiece, where Martha's ceramic angels watched with painted smiles. Beside them sat their wedding photo from 1975, 2 young people full of hope and plans, unable to imagine that someday they'd be arguing about mystical riverboats and century-old vendettas. And what if we're wrong? He asked, turning back to her. What if we dig into this and find out things that put us in real danger? Antoine Arsenault isn't making idle threats, Martha. That car outside isn't parked there by accident. These people have money, influence, and apparently they're willing to use both to get what they want. Martha's expression softened slightly. I know you're scared, Harold. I'm scared too. Then why are we even discussing this? $50,000, Martha. We could pay off the house, set aside money for medical expenses, maybe even leave something for your sister's kids. All we have to do is walk away from something that isn't really ours to begin with. The words hung between them like a barrier. Harold could see Martha processing his arguments, her teacher's mind weighing evidence and outcomes. For a moment he thought he'd reached her, that practical concerns would override whatever romantic notions Celeste's memories had planted. Then Martha moved to the bookshelf and pulled down their photo album from their 40th anniversary cruise. She flipped through pages of pictures, the 2 of them smiling on deck chairs, posing by the ship's rail, dancing awkwardly at the captain's dinner. Remember what you said on that trip? She asked. When we were standing at the rail watching the sunset, and I was talking about all the things we'd never done, the adventures we'd missed. Harold remembered. He'd been feeling philosophical after 2 drinks at dinner, sentimental about their quiet life together. I said we'd had our adventures, that raising your sister's kids after the accident was an adventure, that building a life together was an adventure. And you said that real adventures weren't about treasure hunting or exotic places. They were about doing what's right when it costs you something. Martha closed the album, her fingers tracing its worn cover. This is costing us something, Harold. Our peace of mind, our safety, maybe more. But what if it costs us more to walk away? What if I spend the rest of my life wondering what Celeste was trying to tell us? Harold felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders, the same feeling he'd had when they decided to take in Martha's sister's children, or when he'd chosen to testify against his supervisor's embezzlement scheme years ago. The right choice wasn't always the safe choice. Outside, the grey sedan continued its patient vigil. Harold stood in the growing darkness of their living room, watching Martha's face in the amber glow of the table lamp. 48 years of marriage had taught him to read her expressions like familiar handwriting, and what he saw now was the same quiet resolution she'd worn the night they'd agreed to take in her sister's 3 children after the car accident. The same look she'd had when she'd insisted on testifying against the principal who'd been skimming funds from the school lunch program despite threats to her job. He moved to the window and lifted the curtain again. The grey sedan hadn't moved, its occupant a shadow behind tinted glass. The streetlight caught the gleam of expensive chrome, and Harold realized with a chill that the car's engine was running, exhaust visible in the cool evening air. They weren't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. "They're not going away," he said quietly. "Are they?" Martha joined him at the window, her shoulder touching his. "No, I don't think they are. And Harold, I don't think they're going to let us just walk away, even if we wanted to. We know about the boat now. We've seen what shouldn't exist." The truth of it settled over Harold like a heavy blanket. In his 40 years at the Postal Service, he'd learned that some problems couldn't be ignored into disappearance. Some situations had their own momentum, carrying you forward whether you chose to go or not. The moment they'd opened that storage unit, they'd stepped into a current that had been flowing since 1943. "So what are you saying?" he asked, though he already knew. Martha turned from the window and walked to their old oak dining table, the one they bought second-hand when they were newlyweds, and refinished together in the garage. She pulled out a chair and sat down with the deliberate movements of someone making a formal decision. "I'm saying that tomorrow morning we're going back to that storage unit. We're going to examine that boat properly, and we're going to find out what Celeste hid there. We're going to learn why the Arsenault family is so desperate to get it back that they're willing to threaten two old people who just wanted to buy some antiques." Harold's practical mind immediately began cataloguing objections. "Martha, we don't know what we're doing. We don't have any experience with..." "With what? With standing up to bullies?" Martha's voice carried the steel that had made her one of the most respected teachers in the parish. "Harold, I spent 35 years dealing with people who thought they could intimidate me because I was just a school teacher. School board members who tried to silence me when I spoke up about overcrowded classrooms, parents who thought their money could buy their children special treatment, principals who wanted to sweep problems under the rug rather than address them." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table's worn surface. "And you testified against your own supervisor when you caught him stealing. You could have lost your job, your pension, everything, but you did it because it was right." Harold sank into the chair across from her, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, of course. They'd both spent their lives doing the right thing when it would have been easier to look the away. But this felt different, bigger, more dangerous. "This isn't the same thing," he said weakly. "Isn't it?" Martha reached across the table and took his hands in hers. Her fingers were warm despite the cool evening, and he could feel the slight tremor that had developed since her arthritis worsened. "Harold, whatever the Arsenaults did in 1943, it was bad enough that a young woman risked everything to stop them. And whatever they're hiding, they're still willing to hurt people to protect it. How is that different from any other injustice we've faced?" Harold looked into his wife's eyes and saw something that made his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and terror. Martha wasn't just committed to this course of action, she was transformed by it. The quiet resignation that had settled over her since retirement had vanished, replaced by the passionate educator who fought for her students' futures and the young woman who'd captured his heart with her fierce sense of justice. "They could hurt us," he said quietly. "Really hurt us, Martha. We're not 25 anymore. No, we're not. But we're also not dead yet." Martha's grip tightened on his hands. "Harold, I'm 72 years old. My arthritis is getting worse. My memory isn't what it was, and every morning I wake up knowing I have fewer tomorrows than yesterdays. But right now, tonight, I feel more alive than I have in years. Because something important is happening, and we have a chance to be part of it." Outside, a car door slammed. Harold tensed, but footsteps moved away from their house, probably a neighbor coming home from dinner. The grey sedan remained, patient as a cat watching a mouse hole. Harold squeezed Martha's hands and felt the last of his resistance crumble. She was right. There was no going back now. They'd opened a door that couldn't be closed, picked up a thread that wouldn't be put down. Whether they chose to investigate or chose to hide, they were part of this story now. "All right," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we go back. But we go careful and we go smart." Martha smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in months. The next morning arrived grey and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made Harold's shirt stick to his back before he'd even finished his coffee. Martha had been up since 5, bustling around the kitchen with more energy than he'd seen from her in months. She'd made biscuits from scratch, something she only did when she was working through a problem, and the smell of butter and flour filled the house like a promise. "We need supplies," she announced, setting a plate in front of him along with a steaming mug. "Flashlights, camera, maybe some tools." Harold bit into a biscuit and tried to settle his nerves. Through the kitchen window, he could see their street look normal in the morning light. Mrs. Patterson walking her ancient beagle, the Hendersons' teenage son washing his truck in the driveway. The grey sedan was gone, but somehow that made Harold more nervous, not less. "Martha, about last night." "No second thoughts," she said firmly, though her hands shook slightly as she poured her own coffee. "We decided, Harold, we're seeing this through." After breakfast, they drove to Boudreaux's Hardware on Main Street, where Harold had been buying supplies for 40 years. The owner, Tommy Boudreaux Jr., greeted them with his usual gap-toothed smile. "Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan. What can I do for y'all today?" "Need some heavy-duty flashlights," Harold said, trying to keep his voice casual. "And maybe a crowbar." Tommy's eyebrows rose. "Crowbar? Y'all doing some renovations?" "Just some old storage issues," Martha interjected smoothly. "You know how it is. Things get stuck, need a little persuasion." As Tommy gathered their supplies, Harold noticed a man browsing the tool section who seemed to be paying more attention to their conversation than the merchandise. Expensive shoes, pressed khakis, hands too soft for manual labor. When the man looked up, Harold caught a glimpse of pale eyes and a face that belonged in an air-conditioned office, not a hardware store. "Tommy," Harold said quietly when the store owner returned with their items, "that fellow over there, is he a regular customer?" Tommy glanced over and shook his head. "Never seen him before. Said he was looking for some specialty tools for boat restoration." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, he don't look like he's ever held a wrench in his life." Harold's blood chilled. Boat restoration. They were being watched even here, their movements tracked and anticipated. He paid quickly, gathering the supplies with hands that wanted to shake. Outside, Martha touched his arm. "I saw him too. We're not paranoid, are we?" "No, honey, we're not." They drove toward Riverside Storage in tense silence, Harold checking his mirrors every few blocks. No grey sedan, but that didn't mean they were alone. The Arsenaults had resources, connections. They could afford to be subtle when it suited them. The storage facility looked different in daylight, somehow smaller and more mundane. But Harold felt the same electric anticipation as they approached Unit 247, as if the air itself held secrets. "Wait," Martha said as Harold reached for the lock. "Look at this." She pointed to the concrete floor just inside the unit's threshold. Harold knelt down and saw what she meant. Fresh scratches in the concrete, and what looked like a few drops of oil that hadn't been there yesterday. "Someone's been here," he whispered. They lifted the roll-up door carefully, and Harold's breath caught. The Evangeline sat exactly where they'd left her, pristine and impossible in the cramped space. But something was different. The boat's cabin door, which had been securely latched yesterday, now stood slightly ajar. Martha stepped forward, then stopped abruptly. "Harold, there's something in the water." Harold followed her gaze to the shallow pool of Mississippi River water that surrounded the boat's hull. Floating on the surface were several photographs, their edges curled with moisture. Martha reached down and carefully lifted one out. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and determined eyes standing beside a man in an expensive suit. Even in the faded sepia tones, Harold could see the family resemblance. The man had the same aristocratic features as Antoine Arsenault. "That's her," Martha breathed. That's Celeste. More photos floated in the murky water, images of riverfront mansions, groups of well-dressed people, and what appeared to be business documents. Someone had been here before them, searching the boat, and either accidentally dropped the photographs or left them as a message. We're not the first people to find this boat, Harold realized. The Arsenaults have been looking for it for decades. Martha's hand found his, her grip tight with understanding and fear. They weren't just dealing with a family secret anymore. They were standing in the middle of a 7-decade game of hide-and-seek, and they'd just discovered they weren't the seekers. They were the prize. The photographs bobbed gently in the murky water like fragments of a shattered timeline. Harold knelt beside Martha, his knees protesting against the damp concrete as they gathered the scattered images. Each photograph told part of a story. Celeste standing defiantly before a grand mansion, the same mansion Harold recognized from their research as the old Arsenault estate. Another showed her with a group of people, their faces serious, as if plotting something momentous. "Look at this one," Martha whispered, holding up a photo that made Harold's stomach tighten. It showed Celeste tied to a chair in what appeared to be a basement, her face bloodied but her eyes still burning with defiance. Someone had written on the back in faded ink, "Last warning, tell us where it is." They tortured her. Martha's voice broke slightly. "Harold, they tortured that poor girl." Harold felt a surge of anger so intense it surprised him. In all their years together, Martha had never seen him truly furious. But something about that photograph, about the calculated cruelty it represented, awakened a protective rage he didn't know he possessed. "We're keeping these," he said firmly, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Whatever game they're playing, leaving evidence for us to find, we're keeping every piece." Martha nodded, her teacher's instincts kicking in as she began organizing the photographs chronologically. "They're not random, Harold. Someone arranged these in order, like they're trying to tell us the whole story." As she worked, Harold approached the boat's open cabin door with their new flashlight. The beam revealed that the interior had been thoroughly searched, cushions overturned, panels pried loose, even floorboards lifted. Someone had been desperate, methodical, and ultimately unsuccessful. "They didn't find it," he called back to Martha. "Whatever Celeste hid, it's still here." "How do you know?" Harold emerged from the cabin, his clothes damp from the impossibly present river water. "Because they keep coming back. If they'd found what they were looking for, we'd never have been contacted. The fact that they're still searching means Celeste was smarter than they were." Martha arranged the last photograph and stood slowly, her arthritis making her movements careful. "Harold, I think I know where it is." "Where?" Instead of answering, she stepped toward the boat's wheel. Harold moved to stop her. They'd agreed to be more cautious, but something in her expression made him pause. "When I touched it yesterday, I saw her hiding something," Martha said softly. "Not in the cabin, not in any obvious place. She was thinking about water, about the river itself protecting her secrets." She placed her hand on the wheel, and Harold watched her face transform. Her eyes went distant, unfocused, as if she was seeing through someone else's vision. "The hull," she whispered. She welded a compartment into the hull, below the waterline. "That's why there's always water around the boat. It's not just mystical presence, it's practical. The water hides the access point." Harold felt his pulse quicken. "Are you sure?" Martha released the wheel and turned to him, her eyes bright with certainty. "I can see exactly where it is, but Harold, opening it, that changes everything. Once we see what's inside, we can't pretend we don't know." Before Harold could respond, the sound of car engines echoed from the facility's entrance. Multiple vehicles, moving with purpose. Through the gap beneath the storage unit's door, Harold could see expensive shoes approaching, not just one pair but several. "They followed us," Martha breathed. Harold's mind raced through their options. The storage unit had only one exit, and they could hear voices now, growing closer. Antoine Arsenault's refined accent carried across the morning air, issuing quiet orders to unseen companions. "The boat," Harold whispered urgently. "Get to the boat." They climbed aboard the Evangeline as footsteps stopped just outside Unit 247. Harold heard the distinctive sound of bolt cutters working through metal. They were cutting the lock, not bothering with subtlety anymore. Martha gripped his hand as they crouched in the cabin, surrounded by the evidence of the Arsenault's previous search. Through the boat's small windows, Harold could see shadows moving beyond the storage unit's walls. "Whatever happens," Martha whispered, "we don't tell them about the hull compartment. That's Celeste's secret to keep until we understand what we're protecting." Harold nodded, though his heart hammered against his ribs. They were two pensioners hiding in an impossible boat, facing wealthy, determined people who'd been searching for this moment for 70 years. The storage unit door began to roll upward with a metallic shriek, and morning light flooded in around the boat's impossible presence. Harold heard someone curse softly in French, followed by Antoine Arsenault's measured voice. "Well, well, it seems our elderly treasure hunters have saved us considerable trouble." Martha squeezed Harold's hand tighter as footsteps approached the boat. Their quiet retirement had just ended forever. Harold and Martha remained frozen in the cabin as expensive footsteps circled the Evangeline like predators sizing up cornered prey. Through the boat's small windows, Harold counted at least 4 figures moving in the morning light that now flooded the storage unit. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan. Antoine Arsenault's voice carried the same cultured politeness as their phone conversation, but with an underlying steel that made Harold's skin crawl. "There's no need for dramatics. Please come out so we can discuss this like civilized people." Martha's grip on Harold's hand had become painful, but he didn't pull away. Her touch was the only thing anchoring him as his practical mind catalogued their impossible situation. They were trapped in a 12 by 12 concrete box with people who'd been willing to torture a young woman 70 years ago. "We know you're aboard," a different voice called out, younger, less refined, with an edge of impatience. "The only way out is through us." Harold forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering his postal service training about hostile situations. Stay calm, assess options, don't escalate. But those protocols had been designed for angry customers, not families who'd built empires on blood. "Harold," Martha whispered so quietly he could barely hear her. "The photographs. They left them on purpose. They wanted us to see what they did to Celeste. They're showing us what happens to people who don't cooperate." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The torture photograph hadn't been accidentally dropped evidence. It had been a calling card, a promise of what awaited anyone who stood between the Arsenaults and their 70-year quest. Antoine's voice came again, closer now, as if he stood just outside the cabin. "I understand this situation must be overwhelming. You purchased a storage unit expecting antiques, and instead discovered something that doesn't quite fit the laws of physics. But you see, this boat has been in my family's possession for generations. What you've stumbled upon is essentially stolen property." "That's not true," Martha said, before Harold could stop her. Her teacher's instincts had kicked in. She couldn't let a lie stand unchallenged, even when their lives might depend on it. Silence stretched for a long moment, then Antoine chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Ah, Mrs. Brennan, I was hoping you'd be reasonable. Please, both of you, come out. I promise you'll find this conversation illuminating." Harold squeezed Martha's hand and made a decision that terrified him. They could cower in the cabin, but that would only delay the inevitable. These people had resources, patience, and apparently no qualms about violence. Better to face them while they still had some semblance of dignity. "We're coming out," he called, then helped Martha to her feet. They emerged from the cabin to find 4 people waiting in the cramped storage unit. Antoine Arsenault looked exactly as Harold had imagined, silver-haired, impeccably dressed despite the humid morning, with pale eyes that missed nothing. Beside him stood a younger man who shared his aristocratic features but radiated barely controlled aggression. 2 others flanked the entrance, a woman in expensive clothes who carried herself like private security, and a man whose scarred hands suggested familiarity with violence. "Much better," Antoine said, offering a smile that never reached his eyes. Now then, I believe you've had time to examine our family heirloom. What have you learned?" Harold felt Martha stiffen beside him. This was the test. Everything they'd discovered, everything they'd promised to protect, balanced against their safety and possibly their lives. "We found some old photographs," Harold said carefully. "Seemed like they'd been dropped in the water by accident." "Photographs," Antoine repeated, his tone suggesting he knew exactly which ones Harold meant. "I trust they were educational. You see, my family has been searching for this boat since 1943, when it was stolen by a very troubled young woman named Celeste Boudreau. She took something that didn't belong to her, something my family has never stopped looking for." Martha stepped forward slightly, and Harold's heart nearly stopped. He recognized that stance, that tilt of her chin. She was about to correct a historical inaccuracy, the same way she'd done with countless students over 35 years. "From what we've seen," she said with dangerous calm, "Celeste wasn't a thief. She was trying to stop something terrible from happening." The temperature in the storage unit seemed to drop 10 degrees. Antoine's polite mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and utterly ruthless underneath. "Mrs. Brennan," he said softly, "I'm afraid you've been misinformed. Celeste Boudreau was a mentally unstable young woman who became obsessed with my family. Her delusions led her to commit theft, and ultimately—" He paused, studying their faces. "Well, let's just say her story didn't end well." Harold felt 72 years of careful self-control crack like ice on a warming river. They were standing in an impossible boat that existed outside the laws of physics, surrounded by evidence of decades-old crimes, facing people who spoke of torture and murder as family history. And for the first time in his life, Harold Brennan decided he was done being reasonable. "You killed her," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the storage unit turn toward him. "That's what you're really saying, isn't it? You tortured and murdered a young woman because she wouldn't tell you where she hid your blood money." The younger Arsenault, Antoine's son, Harold realized, took a step forward, his face flushing with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." But Antoine raised a hand, stopping his son's advance. "Actually, I'm impressed, Mr. Brennan. Most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Yes, Celeste Boudreau died during our questioning. But you see, she'd stolen something worth millions, even by 1943 standards. My family couldn't simply let that slide." Martha's hand found Harold's arm, and he could feel her trembling. Not with fear, he realized, but with rage. 35 years of teaching had shown her every kind of human cruelty, but this casual admission of torture and murder seemed to break something inside her. "The gold," she said suddenly. "You want us to help you find the Confederate gold she took. That's why you're here instead of just killing us outright. You still don't know where it is." Antoine's smile returned, genuine this time in its predatory satisfaction. "Very good, Mrs. Brennan. You see, Celeste was quite clever. She hid our family's treasure somewhere on or near this boat, but 70 years of searching have proven fruitless. However, you seem to have developed an unusual connection to the vessel. My sources tell me you've been experiencing visions when you touch certain parts of the boat." Harold's blood turned to ice water. Sources. They'd been watched not just since yesterday, but probably since the moment they'd bought the storage unit. Every conversation, every discovery, every private moment, all of it observed and reported back to these people. "Now then," Antoine continued conversationally, "we're going to conduct a thorough search of this boat, and you're going to help us. Mrs. Brennan, I particularly need you to touch the ship's wheel again and share whatever additional visions you might experience." "No," Martha said simply. The word hung in the humid air like a challenge. The scarred man by the entrance shifted slightly, his hand moving toward his jacket, but Antoine gestured for patience. "I beg your pardon." I said no. "We won't help you find anything. You can do whatever you want to us, but we won't be party to helping murderers profit from their crimes." Harold had never loved his wife more than in that moment. standing defiant in a storage unit surrounded by killers, her chin raised like she was facing down a classroom of unruly teenagers, rather than people who'd casually admitted to torture and murder. Antoine's composure finally cracked completely. "You foolish woman. Do you have any idea what my family is capable of? We've been building power in this region since before the Civil War. We own judges, police chiefs, politicians. We could make you both disappear without anyone asking a single question." "Then do it," Harold said, surprising himself with his steady voice. "But we're not helping you." What happened next unfolded with terrible swiftness. Antoine nodded to the scarred man, who produced a pistol and pointed it at Martha's head. At the same moment, the security woman moved to Harold's side, pressing something hard against his ribs. "Let me be very clear," Antoine said, his cultured voice now carrying the full weight of 70 years of family violence. "You will help us search this boat, or I will have Mrs. Brennan shot. Then you'll help us anyway, and afterward you'll join her. The only variable here is whether she dies now or later." Harold felt the world tilting around him. This wasn't supposed to happen to people like them, retired teachers and postal workers who'd lived quiet lives in small towns. They weren't heroes in adventure stories. They were ordinary people who'd stumbled into something vast and terrible, and now they were going to die for it. But before he could speak, before he could beg for Martha's life or agree to their demands, Martha did something that changed everything. She lunged forward and grabbed the ship's wheel with both hands. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Martha's body went rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. But more terrifying was her voice. When she spoke, it wasn't Martha's familiar tone, but something younger, desperate and furious. "You killed me," the voice said through Martha's lips. "But you'll never find what you're looking for. I made sure of that before you dragged me into that basement. I made sure my death would mean something." Harold watched in horror as his wife convulsed, her body racked by visions or memories that weren't her own. The gun remained pointed at her head, but even the hardened killers seemed unsettled by what they were witnessing. Then Martha collapsed, and Harold's world went dark. Harold's scream pierced the storage unit as Martha crumpled to the deck, her body lifeless against the ancient wood. But even as he lunged forward to catch her, something impossible was happening around them. The Evangeline shuddered, not physically, but in some deeper way that made reality bend at its edges. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with decades of unresolved anguish. The water that perpetually surrounded the boat's hull began to glow with a phosphorescent light that had no earthly source. "What the hell?" the younger Arsenault started, but his words died as Martha's eyes suddenly snapped open. They weren't Martha's warm brown eyes anymore. They blazed with a cold fury that belonged to someone else entirely. She rose to her feet with movements too fluid for a 70-year-old woman with arthritis, her gaze fixed on Antoine with recognition that spanned 7 decades. "Hello, Antoine," she said in that voice that wasn't quite her own, younger, with the faintest trace of a Creole accent that Martha had never possessed. "You look just like your grandfather. Same cold eyes, same casual cruelty." Antoine stepped backward, his composed mask cracking completely. "That's impossible. Celeste is dead. We made sure—" "You made sure of nothing." Martha's body moved with Celeste's remembered grace as she approached the man who'd inherited a legacy of violence. "Did you really think death would stop me? That torture could break what I'd already chosen to protect?" Harold watched in stunned terror as his wife became something else entirely, a vessel for a woman who'd been murdered before he was born, speaking truths that had waited 7 decades for their moment. The scarred gunman still pointed his weapon, but his hands were shaking now. The security woman had released Harold entirely, backing toward the storage unit's entrance as if proximity to the boat had become dangerous. "You want to know where the gold is?" Martha Celeste laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You want to claim your family's blood money? Let me tell you what I learned in 1943, what your grandfather tortured me to reveal." She moved to the boat's rail, her fingers trailing in the impossible water that surrounded them. As she touched it, the liquid began to bubble and churn, releasing images that floated like oil on the surface, ghostly pictures that told a story of unimaginable horror. Harold saw plantations burning, enslaved families torn apart, Confederate soldiers burying chests of gold while their victims' bodies still lay warm in shallow graves. He saw the Arsenault patriarch directing it all with the same cold calculation his descendant displayed now. "The gold you're so desperate to find." Martha Celeste's voice carried the weight of accumulated centuries. "It was never yours to begin with. It was stolen from the dead, melted down from jewelry torn from murdered families, coins pulled from the pockets of people your ancestors shot in cold blood." Antoine's composure shattered completely. "Shut up! You're dead. You have no right." "I have every right!" The voice erupted with such force that the storage unit's concrete walls seemed to vibrate. "I died protecting the truth. You've spent 70 years trying to bury." Harold suddenly understood, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about stolen gold or family vengeance. This was about justice that transcended death itself, about wrongs so profound they'd created their own supernatural momentum. Martha Celeste turned to Harold then, and for a moment he glimpsed his wife's familiar spirit beneath the overlay of someone else's memories and rage. "Harold," she said, her voice now carrying both women's essence, "do you understand what we've really found? This isn't just about money or murder. The Evangeline exists in this impossible space because some injustices are too great for ordinary reality to contain." The water around the boat began to rise, though the storage unit's concrete floor remained dry. Harold realized they were experiencing two realities simultaneously: the mundane world where they'd bought a storage unit for $20, and something far older and more terrible that had been waiting for witnesses. "The gold is here," Martha Celeste continued, her gaze returning to Antoine. "But it's not hidden in any place your family's violence can reach. It exists now as evidence, eternal, untouchable testimony to what your bloodline built its fortune upon." Antoine raised his own weapon, pointing it directly at Martha's chest. "Enough! I don't care what supernatural nonsense this is. Tell me where the gold is, or what?" Harold surprised himself by stepping between the gun and his wife. "You'll kill us? You think death scares people who've already touched something beyond it?" For the first time in his careful, quiet life, Harold Brennan felt the presence of something larger than his own mortality. Martha wasn't just channeling Celeste's spirit. She'd become a conduit for every victim the Arsenault family had created across generations of systematic violence. The revelation completed itself in his mind with crystalline clarity. They weren't just retired pensioners who'd stumbled onto family secrets. They were witnesses to a reckoning that had been building for over a century, instruments of justice that operated beyond the reach of wealth or influence. Everything had shifted. The game's rules had changed completely. The silence that followed Harold's defiant words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Antoine's gun trembled slightly, whether from rage or fear, Harold couldn't tell. But something fundamental had shifted in the storage unit's supernatural atmosphere. The phosphorescent water continued to rise around the Evangeline's hull, and with it came whispers, dozens of voices speaking in languages Harold didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were the voices of the dead, and they were growing stronger. Martha Celeste closed her eyes, her body swaying as if listening to conversations only she could hear. When she opened them again, Harold saw a new clarity there, not just Celeste's fury, but Martha's lifetime of methodical problem-solving. "Harold," she said, her voice now fully her own again, though strengthened by something beyond mortal resolve. "They made a mistake coming here. They thought they were cornering two helpless old people, but they've actually walked into a trap that's been waiting 70 years to spring." Antoine's son stepped forward aggressively. "What are you talking about, you crazy—" "Shut up, Marcus," Antoine snapped, his attention fixed on Martha with growing unease. "What trap?" Martha smiled, an expression that combined her familiar warmth with something far more dangerous. "The same trap Celeste set for your grandfather. You see, she didn't just hide the gold. She made it into evidence. Every coin, every piece of stolen jewelry, every blood-soaked dollar. It all exists now as testimony that can never be silenced or bought. Harold felt understanding dawn like sunrise after the longest night of his life. The boat existed in this impossible space precisely because it had become something beyond mere physical reality. It was a courtroom where the dead could finally testify. "The gold calls to its victims," Martha continued, moving to the ship's wheel with newfound confidence. "Every person your family murdered, every life destroyed to build your fortune, they're all connected to those cursed pieces of metal. And now, standing here in this space between worlds, you've brought yourselves within their reach." The scarred gunman was backing toward the entrance now, his weapon lowered. "Boss, this is wrong. This whole place feels wrong. We should go." But Antoine held his ground, though sweat beaded on his aristocratic forehead. "More parlor tricks and ghost stories. I want that gold, and I want it now." "Then take it," Harold said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at him. Martha raised an eyebrow, but he caught something in her expression, trust and perhaps pride. "Go ahead," Harold continued, addressing Antoine directly. "Touch the wheel, experience what Martha and Celeste experienced. See if your family's blood money is worth claiming once you understand its true price." Antoine's composure finally cracked completely. "I'm not touching anything on this cursed boat. You'll tell me where—" "We're not telling you anything," Martha interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. "But we don't have to. Your presence here has already activated something your grandfather spent his final years trying to prevent. The dead have witnesses now, Antoine. Living witnesses who can speak for them in the world beyond this storage unit." Harold felt pieces clicking together in his mind with the methodical precision of his postal sorting days. "That's why you really came here, isn't it? Not just for the gold, but to silence the only people who'd seen the evidence. You were afraid we'd tell someone." The water around the boat had risen to the storage unit's ceiling now, though somehow they could all still breathe. In its phosphorescent depths, Harold could see shapes moving, dozens of figures in period clothing from across multiple centuries, all watching the confrontation with patient interest. "But here's what you didn't understand," Martha said, approaching the ship's wheel once more. "This boat doesn't just preserve evidence, it creates it. Every moment of your confession, every casual admission of murder and torture, it's all being recorded in ways that transcend your family's ability to suppress." She placed both hands on the wheel, and the effect was immediate. The water exploded upward in a column of light that illuminated faces, hundreds of them, all victims of arsenic violence across generations. But these weren't just ghostly images anymore. They were witnesses in a cosmic trial that had finally found its jury. Harold looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and saw someone he'd never fully recognized before. Not just the patient teacher or devoted partner, but a woman capable of standing against injustice that spanned centuries. The retirement they'd planned, the quiet final years they'd imagined, all of it seemed suddenly small compared to this moment. "We're not the same people who bought this storage unit yesterday," he told Antoine with growing confidence. "We've become something you can't threaten or buy or kill. We've become the voice of everyone you've silenced." Around them, the impossible courthouse of the Evangeline hummed with power that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. The scared gunman had fled entirely now, his footsteps echoing as he ran from the facility. The security woman followed moments later. Only the Arsenaults remained, father and son facing a reckoning that had waited far too long. Antoine's face had gone ashen, but his grip on the pistol remained steady. "Enough theatrics," he snarled, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, search the boat. Tear it apart if you have to." But his son was already backing away, shaking his head. "No, Papa. Look at their eyes. Look at the water. This isn't natural. We need to leave. We're not leaving without what belongs to us." Antoine's composure shattered completely as he swung the gun between Harold and Martha. 70 years my family has waited for this moment. 70 years of searching, of following leads, of of murdering anyone who got too close to the truth. Martha finished quietly. Her hands remained steady on the wheel, and the phosphorescent glow intensified around them. Just like you murdered that storage facility manager last week. Harold felt his blood chill. What? Danny Morrison, Martha said, her voice carrying Celeste's remembered knowledge. He started asking questions about who was paying to watch this particular unit, so they made it look like a heart attack, just like they've done dozens of times before. Antoine's laugh was bitter and sharp. You can't prove anything. No one will believe the ravings of two senile pensioners about ghost boats and supernatural justice. We don't need anyone to believe us, Harold said, understanding flooding through him with absolute clarity. Because we're not going back to our old life. We're not going back to pretending we never saw this. Martha turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce pride. In that moment, Harold saw their entire future reshape itself. The quiet retirement, the careful budgeting, the small concerns that had filled their days, all of it burning away like morning mist before something infinitely larger. You killed Danny Morrison, Harold continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. You've killed God knows how many others. And now you think you can walk away from this place with blood money that's been cursed for over a century. The water around the Evangeline began to churn with increasing violence, and the faces of the dead pressed closer to the surface. Harold could see children among them, enslaved families torn apart for profit, sharecroppers murdered for their land, anyone who'd stood between the Arsenault dynasty and its appetite for wealth. We're finishing this, Martha declared, her knuckles white against the wheel's worn wood. Whatever Celeste started in 1943, whatever justice she died trying to serve, we're seeing it through to the end. Antoine raised his weapon with desperate fury. Then you'll die like she did. The gunshot exploded through the storage unit like thunder, but the bullet never reached its target. The phosphorescent water erupted upward in a protective column, absorbing the projectile with a sound like distant bells. When the light faded, Antoine stumbled backward, his hand burned and empty. The boat protects its witnesses now, Martha said with quiet wonder. We're under the protection of something your family's violence can't touch. Marcus grabbed his father's arm, his face pale with terror. Papa, we have to go. This place, it's not meant for people like us. But Antoine wrenched free, his aristocratic mask completely gone now, revealing the desperate predator beneath. No, I won't be denied by dead slaves and supernatural nonsense. That gold is my inheritance. Then claim it, Harold said with sudden inspiration. He moved to Martha's side, placing his own hands on the wheel beside hers. Stop hiding behind guns and hired killers. Touch the wheel yourself and face what your family built its fortune on. The challenge hung in the supernatural air between them. Around the boat, the dead pressed closer, their faces expectant. Harold could feel their collective will like a physical presence, centuries of unfinished business finally approaching resolution. Antoine's hand shook as he reached toward the wheel, then jerked back as if burned. I won't be manipulated by... You're afraid, Martha observed with clinical precision. You've spent your whole life enjoying the benefits of blood money, but you're terrified to face its true cost. The accusation hit its mark. Antoine's face flushed with rage and shame as he lunged forward, his palms striking the wheel's brass surface with desperate fury. The scream that tore from his throat was barely human, his body convulsed as 70 years of suppressed truth flooded through him. Every murder his grandfather had committed, every life destroyed for profit, every soul that had cried out for justice only to be silenced by violence. When he collapsed to the deck, his son rushed forward, but stopped short of touching him. Antoine's eyes were open but unseeing, lost in visions of accumulated horror that no living mind was meant to contain. Harold looked at Martha, seeing his own transformation reflected in her face. They had stepped across a threshold from which there could be no return. Whatever came next, they would face it as instruments of something larger than themselves. The final confrontation was no longer approaching. It had already begun. Antoine writhed on the deck of the Evangeline, his agonized screams echoing off the storage unit's concrete walls. Through the wheel, 70 years of buried atrocities flooded his consciousness, not as distant history, but as lived experience. He felt every lash of his grandfather's whip, tasted the fear in every victim's final breath, experienced the weight of children torn from their mother's arms for the crime of existing on profitable land. Martha and Harold maintained their grip on the wheel, serving as conduits for the supernatural reckoning that had been building for decades. The phosphorescent water around them churned higher, and Harold could feel the presence of hundreds of souls pressing against the boundary between worlds, all of them demanding their moment of testimony. "Make it stop!" Marcus pleaded, kneeling beside his convulsing father but afraid to touch him. "Whatever you're doing to him, please." "We're not doing anything," Martha said with quiet intensity. "This is what he chose when he touched the wheel. Every Arsenault heir was supposed to experience this, to understand the true cost of their wealth, but they've all been too cowardly to face it." Antoine's body arched impossibly backward, his mouth open in a silent scream. Through their connection to the wheel, Harold and Martha could see fragments of what he was experiencing. Slaves buried alive in the levees to hide evidence of rebellion, entire families poisoned to clear valuable riverfront property, witnesses thrown to the alligators in midnight bayou ceremonies. The weight of accumulated horror was more than any individual consciousness could bear, but something larger was using Antoine as a vessel now. The dead were finally getting their day in court, and he was serving as unwilling jury, judge, and defendant all at once. "The gold," Harold whispered, understanding flooding through him as he watched Antoine's torment. "It's not hidden at all, is it? It's here, in the wheel, in the boat itself. Celeste didn't hide it, she transformed it." Martha nodded, her eyes bright with tears and terrible comprehension. Every piece of stolen wealth melted down and forged into something that could hold their testimony forever. The wheel, the fittings, even the nails in the deck, all of it made from blood money that refused to stay buried. Antoine's screams gradually faded to whimpers as his mind began to fracture under the weight of generational guilt. But the ordeal wasn't finished. The phosphorescent water began to recede, and as it did, the storage unit itself started to change. The concrete walls became transparent, revealing not the Louisiana storage facility, but a vast courtroom that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. Harold gasped as he recognized the space from his wife's earlier visions. This was the trial that Celeste had died trying to make happen, the cosmic judgment that had been postponed for 7 decades while the universe waited for the right witnesses to appear. "We're not just observers anymore," Martha said, her voice carrying new authority. "We're jurors in a trial that spans centuries. Every choice we make from this moment forward will determine whether justice finally prevails or gets buried for another generation." Around them, the courtroom filled with spectral figures. The victims took their places in the gallery, their faces expectant and patient, but the defendant's chair remained empty, waiting. Antoine struggled to his knees, his aristocratic features twisted with pain and dawning horror. The visions had stopped, but their impact remained carved into his psyche like scars that would never heal. When he looked at Harold and Martha now, his eyes held the haunted awareness of someone who'd seen too much truth to ever deny it again. "The trial that should have happened in 1943, he whispered, his voice broken. "She really did it. Celeste really found a way to make us pay." "Trial hasn't happened yet," Harold corrected, feeling knowledge flow through him from sources beyond his understanding. "That's why we're here. That's why the boat called to us. We're the living witnesses who can speak for the dead in both worlds, the supernatural realm where truth cannot be hidden, and the earthly court where justice must be served." Marcus helped his father stand, both men now subdued by the magnitude of what they'd encountered. The arrogance and violence that had sustained the Arsenault legacy for generations seemed pitiful and small in the face of the cosmic machinery that had finally caught up with them. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Martha looked at Harold, and he saw his own resolve reflected in her eyes. They had become something neither of them had imagined possible when they'd bid $20 on a storage unit just days ago. They were no longer retired pensioners worried about stretching their Social Security checks. They were instruments of justice that transcended mortal limitations. "Now," Martha said, her grip tightening on the wheel that had become both witness stand and gavel, "we finish what Celeste started. We take everything we've learned, everything we've seen, and we make sure the world finally hears the testimony of the dead." The cosmic courtroom hummed with power as the final phase of the trial prepared to begin. The cosmic courtroom trembled as reality itself prepared to render judgment. Harold felt the wheel pulse beneath his palms like a living heart, each beat synchronized with Martha's breathing beside him. The spectral gallery was packed now, hundreds of souls spanning generations, all waiting for the moment when their silenced voices could finally be heard. Antoine Arsenault sat slumped in the defendant's chair that had materialized beneath him, no longer the predator who'd entered their storage unit with guns and threats. The visions had broken something fundamental in his mind, leaving him a hollow vessel filled with the accumulated weight of his family's sins. His son Marcus stood behind him, one hand on his father's shoulder, both of them diminished by the supernatural reckoning they could no longer deny. The court recognizes Martha and Harold Brennan as witnesses for the prosecution, a voice announced from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the authority of cosmic justice. Harold realized with a start that the voice was his own, though he hadn't spoken. Something larger was speaking through him now, using his mortal throat to voice eternal judgment. Martha stepped forward, her hands still gripping the wheel that served as both evidence and altar. When she spoke, her words carried the accumulated testimony of every victim the Arsenault family had ever silenced. "We call first the children of the Boudreaux plantation, murdered in 1892 for learning to read," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "We call the sharecropper families poisoned in 1934 for refusing to sell their land. We call Danny Morrison, killed last week for asking too many questions about a storage unit." As each name was spoken, figures materialized in the witness stand, not as ghostly apparitions but as fully realized souls finally given the chance to testify. Harold watched in amazement as decade after decade of buried truth spilled forth, each victim granted their moment of justice. But the courtroom existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Even as the supernatural trial unfolded around them, Harold could feel another layer of reality asserting itself. His postal worker's mind, trained for precision and documentation, began cataloging evidence that would hold up in earthly courts as well. The boat itself is testimony, he realized aloud. Every board, every brass fitting, it all contains trace elements that can be scientifically verified. Celeste didn't just hide the stolen gold, she used it to create physical evidence that links directly to documented murders. Martha nodded, understanding flowing between them without words. "And we have Antoine's confession, recorded not just by supernatural forces, but by the storage facility's security cameras. His admission of Danny Morrison's murder, his family's pattern of violence, all of it preserved in ways that transcend his ability to suppress." Antoine tried to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat. The cosmic trial had stripped him of the silver tongue that had brought silence and corrupted justice for so many years. He could only watch as his family's carefully constructed empire of lies crumbled with each witness's testimony. The phosphorescent water began to rise again, but this time it felt different, not threatening, but cleansing. Harold realized they were witnessing a cosmic baptism of sorts, washing away decades of accumulated evil to make room for something clean and new. The defendant stands accused of perpetuating a cycle of violence that has claimed hundreds of innocent lives. The voice continued through Harold's throat. "How do you plead to these charges?" Antoine's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before words finally emerged, torn from his throat like splinters. "Guilty," he whispered, the admission seeming to cause him physical pain. "All of it. Every murder, every cover-up, every bribe. Guilty." The courtroom erupted in light so brilliant that Harold had to close his eyes. When his vision returned, the supernatural tribunal was fading, but the evidence remained. The Evangelines sat solid and real in their storage unit, every detail preserved as proof of what they'd witnessed. But more importantly, Harold and Martha themselves remained transformed. They were no longer the frightened retirees who'd stumbled onto something beyond their understanding. They had become something unprecedented, living bridges between the world of the dead and the realm of earthly justice. "It's not over," Martha said quietly, though her voice carried absolute certainty. The supernatural trial was just the beginning. Now we take what we've learned and make sure it echoes in every courthouse, every newspaper, every place where truth still matters. Harold looked at his wife with newfound respect and love. Somewhere in the course of fighting for cosmic justice, she had discovered a strength that neither of them had known existed. They were no longer planning a quiet retirement, they were embarking on the most important work of their lives. Antoine and Marcus sat broken in the aftermath of Revelation, their family's legacy of violence finally exposed to forces they couldn't buy or intimidate. The confrontation was over, but Harold understood that the real battle, bringing justice to the earthly realm, was just beginning. The dead had found their voices. Now it was time to make the living world listen. The brilliant light faded, leaving Harold and Martha alone with their transformed understanding of what victory truly cost. The Evangeline remained solid beneath their feet, but the cosmic courtroom had dissolved back into the humble concrete walls of Storage Unit 247. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of reality itself. Martha's hands trembled as she finally released the brass wheel. "Harold," she whispered, her voice carrying both wonder and terrible sadness. "Look at us." Harold glanced down at their intertwined fingers and felt his heart stop. Their hands were translucent now, shot through with the same phosphorescent light that had surrounded the boat. They were still solid, still real, but no longer entirely mortal. "We're becoming like her," Martha continued, understanding flooding her features. "Like Celeste. We've bound ourselves to the wheel, to the testimony, to the justice that needs to be served. We can't go back to our old life because we're no longer entirely part of the living world." The weight of sacrifice settled over Harold like a shroud. Their quiet retirement, their small daily pleasures, their carefully planned final years together, all of it was dissolving like morning mist. They had gained the power to speak for the dead, but the cost was their own peaceful mortality. "Martha," he said softly, his postal worker's practicality warring with cosmic revelation. "What have we done?" She turned to face him fully, and Harold saw tears streaming down cheeks that flickered between solid flesh and spectral light. "We've chosen justice over comfort, truth over safety. But Harold," her voice broke, "we've chosen it for everyone except ourselves." The full magnitude of their sacrifice crystallized with brutal clarity. They possessed the evidence and supernatural authority to bring the Arsenault legacy to earthly justice, but they would never live to see their grandchildren grow up, never tend the small garden Martha had planned for their backyard, never take the cruise they'd been saving for since Harold's retirement. "Look at them." Martha gestured toward the corner where Antoine and Marcus huddled, broken by revelation but still breathing, still tied to the mortal world. They'll face earthly justice, serve prison time, watch their empire crumble, but they'll still have the possibility of redemption, of building something new from the ashes. Harold understood. The Arsenault men would lose their wealth, their power, their freedom, but they would retain their humanity. Harold and Martha had gained cosmic authority, but surrendered their mortal future in the process. "The choice was never really ours, was it?" Harold said with growing clarity. "From the moment we touched that wheel, from the moment we decided to seek justice instead of walking away, we were volunteering for this transformation." Martha nodded, her spectral fingers interlacing with his. "We became the bridge between worlds because someone had to, but bridges don't get to choose which side they belong to. They exist in the space between." The irony cut deep. They had fought for justice, won an impossible victory against generational evil, and gained the power to ensure their triumph echoed through earthly courts. But the price was everything they had hoped to build together in their remaining years. "Do you regret it?" Harold asked, though he already knew the answer from the fierce light in Martha's eyes. "No," she said without hesitation. "I regret what we're losing, God, Harold. I regret that so much my heart feels like it's breaking. But I don't regret the choice. How could I? We've given voices to hundreds of silenced souls. We've stopped a cycle of violence that's lasted for generations." Harold looked around the storage unit one final time, seeing it with eyes that now perceived multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Their $20 bid had purchased far more than they'd ever imagined, and cost them everything they'd never known they were willing to sacrifice. "We need to finish it," he said, understanding their new purpose with crystalline clarity. "Before the transformation completes itself, while we can still function in both worlds, we have to ensure the earthly justice happens." Martha squeezed his hand, her touch both warm and otherworldly. "The evidence we've gathered, Antoine's confession, the scientific proof in the boat itself, we have to get it to people who can act on it." They moved toward the storage unit's entrance, their footsteps echoing strangely in the space between mortal and cosmic realms. Antoine and Marcus remained slumped in defeated silence, their capacity for violence broken by supernatural reckoning. As they stepped into the Louisiana humidity, Harold felt the weight of their sacrifice settle into his bones. They were no longer retiring into peaceful obscurity. They were embarking on the final mission of their mortal existence, ensuring that cosmic justice translated into earthly accountability. The dead had found their voices through Harold and Martha's sacrifice. Now they had to make sure the living world listened, even if they themselves were no longer entirely part of it. Their victory was complete, but it had cost them their future together. The price of justice, Harold realized, was often everything the Seekers held dear. The Louisiana sun felt different against their transformed skin, warmer yet more distant, as if filtered through layers of existence Harold and Martha were only beginning to understand. They stood outside storage unit 247, still holding hands, watching their translucent fingers solidify and fade with each heartbeat. "We need to call Sheriff Boudreau first," Martha said, her voice carrying new authority despite its tremor. "He's been investigating Danny Morrison's disappearance. Antoine's confession gives him everything he needs for an arrest warrant." Harold nodded, pulling out his cell phone with fingers that flickered between flesh and light. The device felt strangely heavy in his grip, as if the simple act of interfacing with mortal technology required increasing effort. And then the FBI. Marcus mentioned federal judges on their payroll. This corruption goes beyond Magnolia Bend. As Harold dialed, he could hear stirring from inside the storage unit. Antoine and Marcus were recovering from their supernatural ordeal, but their confessions had been captured by security cameras that operated in purely earthly dimensions. Whatever cosmic forces had stripped away their ability to lie, the evidence would hold up in mortal courts. "Sheriff Boudreau?" Harold's voice sounded hollow to his own ears. "This is Harold Brennan. We spoke about Danny Morrison yesterday. I'm calling to report his murder, and I have the confession of his killer." The conversation that followed felt surreal. Harold found himself explaining Antoine Arsenault's admission with clinical precision, his postal worker's attention to detail serving him well even as reality shifted around him. The sheriff's initial skepticism transformed into urgent interest as Harold provided specific details about the murder weapon, the disposal site, and Marcus's role in the cover-up. "We'll need you and your wife to come in for statements," Sheriff Boudreau said, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Can you meet us at the storage facility in 20 minutes? Martha touched Harold's arm, and he understood. 20 minutes might be all the time they had left in forms solid enough to interact with earthly authorities. The transformation was accelerating. He could feel his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his mortal mind, connecting with the vast network of testimony they'd helped unleash. "We'll be here," Harold promised, ending the call. Inside the storage unit, they could hear Antoine's voice growing stronger as his supernatural paralysis faded. But something fundamental had changed in him. Gone was the predatory confidence, the casual cruelty that had defined his family's legacy. The cosmic trial had burned away more than his ability to lie. It had cauterized the very source of his violence. "He'll confess to the earthly authorities too," Martha said with certainty. "Not because he wants to, but because he's no longer capable of maintaining the lies that held his empire together. The truth has become part of him now." Harold watched his wife's face flicker between the woman he'd married 40 years ago and something luminous and eternal. The sacrifice was accelerating for both of them, but Martha was embracing it with a grace that took his breath away. "The boat," he realized suddenly. "We need to document everything about the Evangeline before we're too far gone to operate cameras or recording equipment. The brass fittings made from stolen gold, the wood that preserves testimony, it's all physical evidence that scientists can verify." They returned to the storage unit, moving past Antoine and Marcus, who sat in stunned silence. Harold began photographing every detail of the riverboat with methodical precision, while Martha spoke into his phone's recording function, documenting their discoveries with the clarity of a seasoned educator. "The wheel contains trace elements of gold coins stolen from the Boudreau family safe in 1943, she narrated, her teacher's voice steady despite the otherworldly light growing brighter in her eyes. Celeste Boudreau melted down the evidence of her family's murder and forged it into testimony that could never be destroyed or corrupted. As they worked, Harold felt their earthly time running out like sand through an hourglass. Each photograph required more effort, each word felt increasingly distant from his mortal throat. But the documentation was nearly complete, enough evidence to topple the Arsenault empire and expose a century of buried crimes. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the humid air. Sheriff Boudreau had brought backup, probably FBI agents from New Orleans. Harold and Martha exchanged a look that held 4 decades of love and a lifetime of shared purpose. "This is it," Martha whispered, squeezing his hand one final time with fingers that were now more light than flesh. "Our last act as mortals." Harold nodded, feeling profound sadness mixed with fierce pride. They had started this journey as frightened retirees, hoping to supplement their pension. They were ending it as instruments of justice that would echo through generations. The dead had found their voices through Harold and Martha's sacrifice. Now earthly authorities would carry their testimony forward into courts and newsrooms where truth still mattered. Their transformation was nearly complete, but their victory was absolute. Justice would finally be served. The sirens grew silent as Sheriff Boudreau and 3 FBI agents entered Storage Unit 247, their expressions shifting from professional skepticism to stunned disbelief as they confronted the impossible. A 40-foot riverboat somehow contained within 12 feet of concrete walls. But it was Harold and Martha themselves who drew the longest stairs, their forms flickering between solid flesh and translucent light, yet speaking with voices that carried undeniable authority. "Antoine Arsenault confessed to the murder of Danny Morrison," Harold said, his words echoing strangely in the cramped space. "The weapon is a .38 revolver, disposed of in Bayou Teche, approximately 3 miles south of the old sugar mill. The body—" He paused, receiving information from sources beyond mortal knowledge. "The body is weighted down in the same location." Sheriff Boudreau stared at Antoine, who sat slumped against the storage unit wall. When their eyes met, Antoine nodded slowly, the cosmic trial having stripped away his ability to maintain the family's legacy of lies. "It's all true," Antoine whispered, his voice hollow. "Danny found records linking our family to the Morrison disappearances in the 1960s. My father, my grandfather. We've been covering up murders for generations. I continued the tradition because I thought it was protecting our legacy, but it was just perpetuating evil." One of the FBI agents began recording Antoine's statement, while another photographed the Evangeline. The boat remained impossibly solid, its brass wheel gleaming with flecks of melted gold that would yield DNA evidence from victims spanning 8 decades. Martha approached Sheriff Boudreau, her form solidifying with visible effort. "Your great-great-grandmother was Celeste Boudreau," she said gently. "She built this boat as a testament to murdered innocence. Everything you need to prosecute not just Danny's killing, but decades of suppressed crimes, is preserved in this vessel." Sheriff Boudreau's eyes filled with tears as generational truth finally surfaced. "I always wondered why my grandmother spoke about justice like it was a sacred duty. She never explained, just said our family had debts that could only be paid with truth." Harold watched his wife with profound love and loss. Martha had found her true calling in these final moments, not just as a teacher, but as someone who could translate cosmic justice into earthly understanding. She was magnificent, luminous with purpose, and slipping away from him with each passing second. "The storage unit auction," Harold realized, speaking to the agents. "Check the foreclosure records. The Arsenault family forced this sale to reclaim property they'd been searching for since 1943, but they never intended anyone to actually discover what was inside." Marcus finally spoke from his corner, his voice broken with defeat. "We bought storage facilities all along the river, looking for any trace of what Celeste Boudreau had hidden. When the old woman who rented this unit died, we thought we'd finally found it. We never expected—" He gestured helplessly at the impossible boat. As the agents worked, documenting evidence that would hold up in courts from Louisiana to Washington, D.C., Harold felt himself becoming increasingly detached from the physical world. Yet paradoxically, his understanding of justice, true justice, had never been clearer. "Martha," he whispered, reaching for her hand one last time. She turned toward him, her face radiant with the same light that had surrounded Celeste Boudreau's testimony. But her eyes, those beloved brown eyes that had looked at him with love through 40 years of marriage, remained entirely his Martha. "I know," she said softly. "I can feel it too. We're not going home to our little house, are we?" Harold shook his head, unable to speak past the emotion choking his throat. "But look what we've done," Martha continued, gesturing toward the agents cataloguing evidence, toward Antoine's broken confession, toward Sheriff Boudreau, who was finally understanding his family's true legacy. "We stumbled into something impossible and chose to see it through. We chose justice over safety, truth over comfort. That's not a small thing, Harold, that's everything." Harold felt his consciousness expanding, connecting with voices across decades of silenced testimony. But at the center of that vast cosmic awareness remained one constant truth: his love for the remarkable woman who had shared this impossible journey. "Will we still be together?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Martha's smile lit up the storage unit with otherworldly radiance. "We've been partners in everything else. Why would eternity be different?" Around them, earthly justice was finally taking its course. But Harold and Martha Brennan were no longer entirely part of that world. They had become something unprecedented, bridges between realms, guardians of testimony that would echo through generations. They had purchased a $20 storage unit, hoping to supplement their retirement. Instead, they had found their true calling as instruments of cosmic justice. The price was everything they had planned together, and somehow it was worth it. Their mortal story was ending, but their real work was just beginning. The new beginning. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the Magnolia Bend Community Center, illuminating rows of folding chairs filled with reporters, federal agents, and townspeople who had gathered for the final press conference in what media had dubbed the Evangeline Revelations. District Attorney Sarah Chen stood at the podium, her voice carrying the weight of historic justice finally served. "Today marks the conclusion of the largest corruption investigation in Louisiana's modern history," she announced. "Antoine and Marcus Arsenault have been sentenced to life without parole for multiple murders spanning 6 decades. Additionally, 17 public officials, including 2 federal judges, will face prosecution for their roles in suppressing evidence and obstructing justice. In the back of the room, Sheriff Boudreaux, now Lieutenant Boudreaux of the Louisiana Bureau of Investigation, watched with quiet satisfaction. The promotion had come with his family's vindication, as DNA evidence from the Evangeline's brass fittings had confirmed the murders of his ancestors and dozens of other victims. The boat itself had become the centerpiece of the prosecution, its impossible preservation providing irrefutable testimony that no earthly court could dismiss. But it was the empty chairs in the front row that drew the longest glances, 2 seats reserved for Harold and Martha Brennan, whose bodies had been found peacefully embracing beside the riverboat 3 days after their final statements to authorities. The coroner had ruled it natural causes, simultaneous heart failure brought on by the stress of their ordeal. Only a few witnesses to those final supernatural moments understood the true nature of their sacrifice. The Brennan Foundation, Darchen continued, established with the reward money from solving these cold cases, will provide support for families of murder victims whose cases have been dismissed or inadequately investigated. It seems fitting that Harold and Martha's discovery should continue protecting the vulnerable. After the press conference dispersed, Sheriff Boudreaux made his way to the storage facility on Route 90. Unit 247 had been converted into a memorial site, the Evangeline preserved exactly as the Brennans had found it. Visitors came daily, some seeking closure for their own lost loved ones, others simply marveling at the impossible boat that had exposed generations of buried truth. As Boudreaux approached the entrance, he noticed something that had become routine yet never failed to move him. Fresh flowers lay beside the memorial plaque, though no one had been seen placing them there. White chrysanthemums and yellow roses, Martha's favorites, according to her neighbor Mrs. Tran, who had become the site's unofficial guardian. Inside the unit, the Evangeline gleamed with the same otherworldly preservation that had mystified investigators. Scientific analysis had confirmed what Harold and Martha discovered. The boat existed in a state that defied conventional physics, maintained by forces that transcended earthly understanding. The brass wheel still showed traces of melted gold, each fleck containing DNA evidence that had convicted the Arsenault family and their conspirators. But it was the logbook beside the wheel that drew Boudreaux's attention, a leather journal that had appeared sometime after the Brennans' death, its pages filled with Martha's careful handwriting, documenting not just their investigation, but reflections on justice, sacrifice, and the courage required to speak truth to power. The final entry, dated the morning of their transformation, read, "Harold and I have learned that some discoveries choose their discoverers. We were meant to find the Evangeline, just as it was meant to find us. If someone is reading this, remember, justice isn't a destination but a journey that requires each generation to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience." The work continues. Boudreaux had read the entry dozens of times, each viewing revealing new layers of meaning. The Brennans had started their retirement hoping for modest supplemental income and ended it as instruments of cosmic justice. Their sacrifice had exposed not just individual crimes, but an entire system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. As he prepared to leave, Boudreaux noticed movement near the boat's wheel, not physical, but a shift in light that seemed to acknowledge his presence. He had experienced similar moments before, brief impressions of warmth and approval that felt distinctly like the elderly couple who had chosen justice over their own peaceful mortality. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty air, as he had many times before. The response came not in words but in feeling, a sense of profound satisfaction mixed with anticipation, as if Harold and Martha were not resting but actively engaged in work that spanned realms beyond earthly understanding. They had become what they'd never intended, eternal guardians ensuring that truth could never again be permanently buried by power and privilege. Walking back toward his car, Boudreaux reflected on the transformation that had touched everyone connected to the Evangeline's discovery. The Brennans had found their true purpose in their final act, exposing evil that had festered for generations. Their sacrifice had created ripples of justice that would protect innocent lives for decades to come. The $20 storage unit had indeed supplemented their retirement, not with antiques or forgotten treasures, but with meaning that transcended mortal concerns. Harold and Martha Brennan had discovered that some prices were worth paying. Some sacrifices transformed loss into eternal purpose. Their new beginning had no earthly end.